What I'm about to reveal is one of the most calculated systems of psychological destruction ever created by a Roman emperor. A man who history remembers as practical and sensible, designed institutions where the daughters of his enemies were systematically degraded, while their fathers were forced not just to witness, but to actively participate in their humiliation. These weren't prisons. They weren't execution chambers. They were establishments where family honor was destroyed, where fathers became instruments of their own daughters' suffering, where entire bloodlines were shamed in ways that ancient societies considered worse than death. The emperor was Vespasian, founder of the Flavian Dynasty, the man who stabilized Rome after civil war. But before he became emperor, he orchestrated a campaign of cultural annihilation against the Jewish people that included this horrifying innovation.
The question historians still debate is whether this was strategic brilliance or monstrous cruelty. Perhaps most disturbingly, it was both. The year 69 CE became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, 12 months of chaos that nearly tore the Roman Empire apart. After Nero's suicide in June 68 CE, the carefully constructed fiction that emperors were chosen by merit rather than military force collapsed completely. 4 different men claimed the purple imperial toga within a single year. Galba, an elderly senator, ruled for 7 months before being assassinated in the Forum. Otho, who had orchestrated Galba's murder, held power for 3 months before losing a battle to his rival and taking his own life. Vitellius, supported by the Rhine legions, marched on Rome and became emperor, only to face yet another challenger.
That challenger was Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known to history as Vespasian. In mid-69 CE, Vespasian was not in Rome but in Judea, commanding Roman forces in a brutal campaign to suppress a massive Jewish revolt. He was 60 years old, from a family of tax collectors and mule traders, lacking the aristocratic pedigree that Romans expected in their leaders. But he had something more valuable than ancient lineage. He commanded battle-hardened legions that were loyal to him personally, and he controlled Egypt, the province that supplied grain to feed Rome's 1,000,000 inhabitants. When his legions proclaimed him emperor in July 69 CE, Vespasian didn't rush to Rome. Instead, he continued his work in Judea, leaving his generals to defeat Vitellius, while he finished what he had started: the complete subjugation of the Jewish people. This decision revealed something essential about Vespasian's character. He was methodical, thorough, and utterly unsentimental about the use of extreme violence to achieve political objectives. To understand what Vespasian created in Judea, we must first understand the context of the Jewish War and why it provoked such a savage Roman response. Judea had been under Roman control for over a century, but it had never been fully pacified. The Jewish people maintained a fierce attachment to their monotheistic religion, their laws, and their temple in Jerusalem. Unlike other conquered peoples who could easily incorporate Roman gods into their pantheons, Jews refused to worship the emperor as divine, refused to place his image in their temple, and periodically erupted in revolt when Roman governors pushed too hard against their religious practices. In 66 CE, accumulated tensions finally exploded into open rebellion. Jewish rebels attacked and massacred the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, defeated a Syrian legion sent to suppress them, and declared independence from Rome.
The rebellion united different Jewish factions: Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and others, in temporary alliance against Roman rule. This was precisely the kind of challenge that Rome could not tolerate. The empire was built on the principle of overwhelming military superiority and the certainty that rebellion would be crushed. If Judea successfully broke away, other provinces might follow. Emperor Nero dispatched Vespasian with 3 legions, approximately 60,000 troops including auxiliaries, to restore Roman control. What followed was not a quick military campaign, but a systematic, grinding war of annihilation. Vespasian's approach to the Jewish war revealed the man who would later become emperor. He didn't seek glory through reckless attacks or dramatic gestures. Instead, he applied methodical pressure, besieging cities one by one, cutting supply lines, and allowing hunger and disease to weaken resistance before launching final assaults. City after city fell to Roman siege tactics. When walls were breached, Roman soldiers were given permission to plunder, destroy, and take captives. Ancient historians record that Vespasian's legions captured tens of thousands of prisoners as they advanced through Galilee and Judea. These weren't soldiers taken in battle, but civilians, entire families from conquered cities who became spoils of war. Under Roman law and custom, prisoners of war became property of the state, to be disposed of as commanders saw fit. Male prisoners of military age were typically enslaved and sent to labor in mines or on construction projects. Older men were sometimes executed if deemed dangerous. But women and children represented a different category of captive, one that Vespasian would exploit in ways that shocked even Roman observers. The traditional Roman response to conquered peoples involved a combination of integration and intimidation. Cooperative elites were incorporated into Roman administration. The general population was allowed to continue their lives under Roman law, paying taxes but otherwise undisturbed. Those who resisted were punished severely, with crucifixion being the preferred method of execution for rebels, creating forests of crosses along roadways as warnings to others. But Vespasian faced a unique challenge with the Jewish rebellion. This wasn't a fight over territory or taxes. It was a cultural and religious conflict. Jewish identity was built around the law of Moses, the temple in Jerusalem, and concepts of purity and family honor that were central to their entire worldview. Simply killing rebels wouldn't destroy the culture that produced them. Vespasian needed to attack Jewish identity itself, to demonstrate that their religious laws couldn't protect them, that their God had abandoned them, and that Roman power could violate everything they held sacred. It was in this context that Vespasian created what ancient sources call the houses of shame. The exact Latin terminology varies across sources, with some referring to them as lupanaria, standard brothels, while others use terms that suggest something more specifically designed for humiliation of captives. What is clear from multiple ancient historians is that Vespasian established institutions specifically for the daughters of Jewish aristocratic and priestly families, and that he designed these establishments to maximize psychological destruction of the entire family line. The process began with careful selection of captives. When a Jewish city fell, Roman officers would identify families of significance: rabbis, priests, members of the Sanhedrin, wealthy merchants, anyone with status in Jewish society. Their daughters, particularly those of marriageable age, were separated from other prisoners. In Jewish culture of this period, family honor and female modesty were foundational values. Unmarried daughters were carefully guarded, their reputations protected because the family's status depended on making honorable marriage alliances. The concept of modesty, tzniut, governed every aspect of behavior, dress, and interaction. For a young woman to be exposed to strangers, let alone to participate in the activities Vespasian planned, represented complete destruction of family honor. But Vespasian's innovation went beyond simply forcing these young women into degrading circumstances. He specifically required that their fathers serve as collectors of payment from those who came to these establishments. The fathers, prominent men who had been community leaders, were placed at the entrances to these houses of shame. They were forced to take payment from Roman soldiers and others, to record transactions, and to remain present while knowing exactly what was happening to their daughters inside. The psychological torture this arrangement created was precisely calibrated to destroy the social structure of Jewish resistance. In Jewish tradition, a father's primary obligation was to protect his family, particularly his daughters, and to guard family honor. The entire system of Jewish law regarding marriage, modesty, and family relations was built around these obligations. What Vespasian created forced fathers to become active participants in the destruction of their daughters and the annihilation of family honor. They couldn't protect, couldn't intervene, couldn't even look away. They had to engage in the commercial transaction that enabled the violation, taking money, and thereby becoming, in the eyes of everyone watching, partners in what was occurring. Ancient sources describe how these establishments operated. They were typically located near Roman military camps, ensuring a steady stream of soldiers. The buildings were marked with symbols that made their purpose unmistakable. Inside, the daughters of Jewish families were kept under guard, unable to escape, forced to comply with whatever was demanded or face beatings or execution. Outside, their fathers sat or stood in positions where they couldn't avoid knowing what was happening. Some sources suggest they were required to call out to potential customers, advertising what was available inside, though this detail is disputed by some historians. The Roman soldiers who frequented these establishments understood exactly what was happening. They weren't visiting ordinary commercial establishments. They were participating in a calculated humiliation of a conquered people. For many soldiers, this added to the appeal. They were demonstrating Roman dominance in the most intimate and violating way possible. Some ancient sources suggest that prices were deliberately kept low, making these establishments more accessible and increasing the number of men who would participate, thereby maximizing the humiliation. The impact on the Jewish families trapped in this system is difficult to fully comprehend across 2 millennia of cultural change. For the young women, the trauma was immediate and physical, but it was compounded by the knowledge that their fathers were outside, that their entire family's honor was being destroyed, that even if they survived, they would be unmarriable, outcasts, living symbols of family shame. For the fathers, the psychological torture was different, but equally devastating. Every moment required them to choose between impossible options. Refuse to participate and watch your daughter be executed. Comply and become an active participant in her degradation. Some sources suggest that certain fathers attempted resistance, refusing to take payment or trying to interfere. These men were typically executed publicly, and their daughters' situations were made worse as punishment. Other fathers apparently lost their sanity. the psychological weight of what they were forced to do and witness breaking their minds completely. The broader Jewish community in Judea heard about these houses of shame through refugees and travelers. The news spread through synagogues and markets, carried by those who had escaped or been released. The effect was exactly what Vespasian intended. Jewish families in cities not yet conquered understood that surrender wouldn't protect them, that Roman victory meant not just political subjugation but systematic destruction of everything they valued. This should have strengthened resistance, but instead it often created despair. How do you fight when defeat promises such comprehensive annihilation? Some Jewish fighters did become more determined, choosing death in battle over surrender. But others, particularly those with families, faced impossible calculations about whether continued resistance would make their family's fate worse. This psychological warfare was Vespasian's innovation, using cultural destruction as a weapon as potent as his legions. The Roman military commanders under Vespasian had varied reactions to the houses of shame. Some embraced them as effective psychological warfare and useful amenities for the troops. Others expressed private discomfort, recognizing that what was happening went beyond normal practices of war even by Roman standards. But no one openly challenged Vespasian's policy. He was their commander, and increasingly it was clear he might become emperor. Opposing him meant professional suicide at best, actual execution at worst. The system expanded as the war continued. As more cities fell, more establishments were created. By the time Vespasian's son Titus besieged Jerusalem in 70 CE, there were reportedly dozens of these houses throughout Judea, holding hundreds of young women and employing their fathers as unwilling participants in systematic shame. When Vespasian left Judea in late 69 CE to claim the imperial throne in Rome, he left the continuation of the war to his son, Titus. Titus would complete the conquest by destroying Jerusalem and its temple in 70 CE, but the houses of shame that his father had created continued operating. Titus maintained the policy, recognizing its effectiveness at breaking Jewish resistance and its utility for maintaining troop morale. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE produced tens of thousands of additional captives, and many were incorporated into the existing system. After the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem lay in ruins, Jewish prisoners were distributed throughout the empire. Some were taken to Rome itself to be displayed in Vespasian's triumph. Others were sold in slave markets, and others were sent to work on Vespasian's massive construction projects, including the amphitheater that would become known as the Colosseum. But the houses of shame in Judea continued operating for years after the main war ended, maintained as permanent institutions of occupation. The historical evidence for these establishments comes from multiple ancient sources, though the details are often disturbing enough that historians have been reluctant to engage with them fully. Josephus, the Jewish historian who witnessed the war firsthand before defecting to the Roman side, makes oblique references to the treatment of captive women and the systematic humiliation of prominent families. He doesn't provide graphic details, perhaps out of respect for the victims, or because the practices were so well known they didn't require elaboration. Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius mention unusual practices in Vespasian's Judean campaign, though again without full specificity. The pattern across sources is consistent: establishment of institutions designed to humiliate prominent Jewish families, forced participation of fathers, and systematic cultural destruction as military policy. Modern historians debate how widespread this practice was, and whether it was formal policy or something that developed organically during the campaign?
The evidence suggests it was deliberate policy, created and maintained by command authority, not random abuse by individual units. The coordination across multiple locations, the systematic selection of particular families, and the specific requirement for fathers to participate all indicate centralized planning. When Vespasian became emperor in late 69 CE, he faced the challenge of presenting himself to Rome as a legitimate ruler, despite his common origins. He emphasized his military victories, his restoration of order after civil war, and his practical administrative competence. The triumph he celebrated in 71 CE with Titus displayed the treasures looted from the Jerusalem temple, paraded Jewish captives through Rome's streets, and commemorated the complete victory over Jewish rebellion. What was not mentioned in official celebrations were the specific methods used to achieve that victory. The houses of shame were not discussed in polite Roman society, not because they were unknown, but because they represented practices that even Romans, who were accustomed to brutal warfare, found disturbingly excessive. The policy revealed something about Vespasian that complicated his image as a sensible, moderate emperor. He was capable of creating and maintaining systems of calculated cruelty that targeted not just individuals, but family structures and cultural identity. This wasn't passionate anger or impulsive brutality. It was cold, systematic, and frighteningly effective. The Jewish communities that survived the war carried the trauma of these practices for generations. Rabbinical writings from the centuries following the war contain references to the suffering of daughters and the shame of fathers forced to participate in their dishonor. These texts struggle with profound theological questions. Where was God's protection? How could such things happen to faithful families? How could communities rebuild when family honor had been so comprehensively destroyed? Some families whose daughters had been trapped in these establishments faced difficult decisions when the war ended. The young women who survived were technically alive, but in the eyes of strict religious law, they were ruined, unmarriageable, sources of shame. Some families rejected these survivors, unable or unwilling to integrate them back into family and community life. Other families tried to rebuild, recognizing that the young women were victims, not willing participants. Rabbinical courts issued various rulings about the status of these survivors, with some authorities showing compassion and others rigidly enforcing purity laws. The long-term impact of Vespasian's campaign against Jewish cultural identity extended far beyond the immediate victims. The destruction of the temple in 70 CE fundamentally transformed Judaism from a temple-centered religion to one focused on Torah study and synagogue worship. But the trauma of the war, including the systematic humiliation that families had endured, shaped Jewish identity in profound ways. There developed an intense emphasis on martyrdom, on the principle that one should die rather than submit to certain violations of religious law. The concept of Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name through martyrdom, became central to Jewish religious thought.
This emphasis can be understood partly as a response to what had happened, a determination that future generations would choose death over the kind of comprehensive dishonor that Vespasian's policies had inflicted. The Jewish diaspora, the dispersion of Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, accelerated after 70 CE. Communities in places like Alexandria, Babylon, and eventually Europe maintained their distinct identity while living under foreign rule. The memory of what had happened in Judea, the understanding that assimilation or cooperation with occupying powers couldn't protect against systematic cultural destruction, reinforced the determination to maintain distinct Jewish identity regardless of circumstances. For Rome, the methods Vespasian had employed in Judea set troubling precedents.
While the houses of shame seem to have been specific to the Jewish war and weren't replicated as standard policy in other conflicts, they demonstrated how far imperial power could go in destroying conquered peoples. Later emperors, facing rebellions, would remember that cultural annihilation, systematic humiliation, and the targeting of family structures were available tools of imperial policy. The Flavian dynasty that Vespasian founded ruled for 27 years, from 69 to 96 CE. Vespasian himself ruled for 10 years, succeeded by his sons Titus and Domitian. The dynasty is remembered for stabilizing Rome after civil war, for completing the Colosseum, and for generally competent administration. But the foundation of Flavian power was built on the complete subjugation of Judea and the systematic destruction of Jewish resistance through methods that included the houses of shame. Modern historians studying the Roman-Jewish War have often focused on military tactics, siege warfare, and the destruction of the temple. The systematic humiliation of prominent families has received less attention, partly because ancient sources are circumspect about details, partly because the subject matter is disturbing, and partly because it doesn't fit comfortable narratives about Roman civilization. But understanding what Vespasian created is essential to understanding both the nature of Roman imperial power and the trauma that shaped Jewish historical memory. The archaeological record provides some corroboration of ancient texts. Excavations at Roman military sites in Judea have uncovered structures that may have served the purposes described in ancient sources, though definitive identification is difficult.
What is clear is that Roman military camps in occupied Judea included facilities beyond those typical for legionary fortresses, and that these facilities served purposes connected to the exploitation of conquered populations. The question of individual responsibility versus systemic violence is particularly complex in this case. Vespasian created the policy and presumably gave orders for its implementation. His officers carried out those orders, selecting families and establishing the institutions. Roman soldiers participated in the system, visiting the establishments, and thereby becoming direct participants in the humiliation. But the system couldn't function without extensive support personnel, guards, administrators, those who supplied the establishments, and the broader military and political structure that normalized these practices. Was everyone involved equally culpable? Or does responsibility concentrate at the top with those who designed and ordered the system? These questions don't have simple answers, but they're essential to ask. As we reflect on what Emperor Vespasian created in Judea, we confront disturbing truths about how power operates and how systematic cruelty can be integrated into state policy. This wasn't the random violence of warfare, but calculated, institutionalized humiliation designed to destroy cultural identity and family structures. It was created not by a figure history remembers as a monster, but by an emperor praised for practical governance and administrative competence. This contradiction is crucial. It reveals that moral decency and systematic cruelty aren't opposite ends of a spectrum, but can coexist within the same person, the same administration, the same state. Vespasian could simultaneously reform Roman finances, rebuild infrastructure, and maintain institutions of calculated degradation. This capacity for compartmentalization, for treating some humans as worthy of basic dignity while systematically destroying others, appears throughout history. The victims of this system, the young women trapped in houses of shame, and the fathers forced to participate in their dishonor, were real people whose lives were comprehensively destroyed for strategic purposes. They became tools of imperial policy,
their suffering transformed into a weapon against their community's resistance. Their trauma served Rome's interests, and then they were largely forgotten by the historical record, mentioned briefly in ancient texts, then ignored by centuries of scholarship that preferred to focus on military campaigns and political structures. The Jewish communities that survived carried these memories forward, though often in coded or oblique references rather than explicit descriptions. The trauma became part of collective memory, shaping how these communities understood power, danger, and the need to maintain identity, even under extreme pressure. This historical memory influenced responses to persecution in later centuries, creating patterns of resistance and survival that can be traced back to the Roman-Jewish War and its aftermath. For Rome, the methods Vespasian employed demonstrated the empire's willingness to use any means necessary to maintain control. The systematic nature of what was done, the coordination required, the resources invested in creating these institutions of humiliation, all indicate that this was considered legitimate state policy, not excess or abuse, but deliberate strategy. This reveals something profound about the nature of imperial power, its ability to normalize cruelty, to transform atrocity into administrative procedure, to make the unspeakable routine. The silence of Roman society about these practices is also revealing. Senators knew what had happened in Judea. Officers who served under Vespasian knew. Soldiers who participated knew. Yet when Vespasian became emperor and celebrated his triumph, when he was praised for restoring order and governing competently, these methods weren't discussed publicly. There was collective agreement to look away, to focus on achievements, while ignoring the means by which they were accomplished. This pattern of deliberate ignorance, of knowing but not acknowledging, appears repeatedly when societies confront the darker actions of their governments. If this investigation into one of Rome's most disturbing policies has given you insight into how systematic cruelty operates and how power can corrupt even seemingly practical leaders, subscribe to this channel. We bring you historical truths that conventional narratives often sanitize, the stories that reveal uncomfortable realities about human nature and the operation of power. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our explorations of history's darkest corners, where policy and atrocity intersect. Here's a question for the comments. When an empire or state implements systematic cruelty as policy rather than allowing random violence, does that make the moral situation better or worse? Is calculated, organized abuse more or less condemnable than chaotic brutality? This is a complex ethical question with implications for how we judge historical and contemporary actions. I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts. Next time, we'll be uncovering another shocking chapter from ancient history, one involving a practice so disturbing that it was hidden from public knowledge for over 1,000 years. Trust me, what we reveal will challenge fundamental assumptions about a civilization usually portrayed as enlightened and advanced. Until then, remember that understanding history's darkness isn't about dwelling on suffering, but about recognizing patterns of power and abuse that continue to shape our world. Some lessons are too important, too relevant to modern challenges, to ever forget.